Basically, these are companies that have a deep conviction of, and really it's part of the DNA to keep adding and incubating new businesses that have the potential to be massive growth engines. They expect many of these things to fail and they take failure in their stride. And a good example is the Bezos quote. It says staying in day one requires you to experiment patiently, accept failures, plant seeds, protect saplings, and double down when you see customer delight. And Amazon is one of the great spawner companies that we have. Spawning also has a lot of advantages, in fact, a lot more advantages than cannibals, because cannibals have to pay tax on their earnings and then they can use the money to buy back shares. In the case of spawning, what you're doing is you're basically reducing your net income, which basically then reduces your taxes. So in effect, you're getting a interest-free loan from the government on very easy terms, payable when able. So for example, through most of its history, Amazon has hardly reported much in earnings. Their core businesses were quite profitable, but they were taking all the cash flows and continuously investing them into new bets. 30, 40% of the money that they were investing would have gone to the government if they didn't do that. So it's a very capital efficient way to do this if you are good at spawning. So there are different kinds of spawners, and I came up with these different spawners on my own. And they may be more, but I think this captures a lot of it. So adjacent spawners are companies that create businesses that are close to the business they already are in. They kind of are looking at, like Amazon when they started was only selling books, and then they started adding more categories. They started selling music, and they kept adding more categories. So it didn't require a lot of change in the business. That's what I would call adjacent spawners. Embryonic spawners are companies that acquire businesses and then nurture them into much larger enterprises. And for example, through most of its history, Microsoft has not been a acquisitive company. It basically kind of grew its businesses organically, but they bought what we know as PowerPoint as they actually bought the company, and then they changed the name to PowerPoint and then made it part of Office. So that was the example of an embryonic spawner. Cloner spawners are not innovative. They just copy successful products. Microsoft is a good example of cloner spawners. And then non-adjacent spawners create or buy new unrelated business areas. So for example, recently during the pandemic, BYD went into manufacturing of N95 masks. And that business has nothing to do with what one would consider the core competencies of BYD. But Cheng-Fu Wang has never been limited by core competencies. He's repeatedly gone into businesses. When you would look at him from the outside, you would say he has no competence in this. But he's repeatedly shown that he can get competence. So they entered the car business and they were able to make that quite a success, which is difficult. They entered the N95 mask business, and I'm pretty sure they've, if they haven't already turned into business, they will. And then Apex Spawner is a business which uses all four of these strategies and such. And generally speaking, the reason I'm giving you these spawner categories is Apex spawners are very rare, and Apex spawners can be amongst the very best investments you can make because they've got so many different ways to nirvana. They've got, it's kind of a Swiss Army knife. They can bring out different tools, and they're really good at all of the above. So let's look at some of these spawners with some examples. So adjacent spawns, we can look at Starbucks. They've created the consumer packaged goods, the Frappuccino bottles, which first they did a deal with Pepsi, which they sold in supermarkets. They created a coffee machine. I think now in China, they have opened the Starbucks Reserve stores, which have done really well. And they're also experimenting with alcohol, alcohol infused drinks and such, which is quite a significant departure from what is traditionally a Starbucks store. But they're doing all these spawns, and it extends the runway. Facebook has been really good at embryonic spawning, where they bought Instagram and they bought WhatsApp, they bought Oculus, and they have taken these embryonic businesses and they've created pretty significant value and growth. The same with what Google did with YouTube, very significant growth, or what Google did with Android, which is also a company they bought. Microsoft doesn't do much embryonic spawning, but like I told you, they bought a company named Forethought and then later renamed it as PowerPoint. But they are very good at cloner spawning, Windows from the Mac, Word and Excel from WordPerfect and Lotus, Explorer from Netscape, Surface from the iPod, Azure from Google and Amazon Web Services, and Teams from Slate and such. Apex spawners, I told you, they're very rare, and if you can spot a Apex spawner early in its journey, it can be very, very attractive and can give you a pretty long runway. Because what happens is that Amazon started with just a bookstore. It's like all eggs in one basket, but as they start doing more things, because these are mostly digital bets, the return on capital is extremely high, and so it can also tolerate a lot of failure. So they've done a very good job with obviously the adjacent spawning, embryonic spawning, like they bought Zappos and Whole Foods. Cloner, some of these cloners didn't work. Like they came up with the Fire Phone, which they offered for I think 99 cents, but they couldn't get any traction, and then the Fire Phone was buried and they moved on. And then they've done non-adjacent spawning, like Amazon Web Services is quite a departure from their typical retail, and it's done very well. And Kindle was quite a departure because it required quite a few different competencies. Similarly, Alphabet has done all of the above. They've done a lot of embryonic stuff. They've also done a lot of non-adjacent stuff where they've gone into things like Google Fiber and so on. Alibaba, you guys are very familiar with, Alipay with the adjacent spawning, and they've done a number of things on the embryonic front, cloners, and then even the non-adjacent with the Alibaba Cloud and AliTrip. Berkshire Hathaway Reinsurance was a spawn that Ajit Jain did for them, probably worth over $100 billion in value that business has created for Berkshire from scratch, where they pretty much didn't have to put up a lot of risk capital to make that happen. Embryonic, they bought Geico, and it had been around for a long time, but it was pretty small, less than 2% market share of the US insurance business, and now it's more than 10%. Mid-American Energy has grown a lot. Nebraska Furniture Mart has grown a lot. They've started some digital insurance companies recently, 3 Insurance and Buy Burke. These are cutting out the agent. And so they've cloned some of the other players like I think Wilcox and so on. And then Tencent, again, has done a number of things on all of the above. You guys use WeChat, the games, future mobility. And Baidu is very similar. Again, they've kind of done all of the above, and these have been tremendous home runs, especially if you got them early.